So now it's time to start working on the inner container. This is just standard stacked ring construction. I've taken various species of scrap material and I've generated these boards that are about 1 inch tall, about 3/4 inch thick, and I'm just going to gang cut a series of segments. I'll first do a test ring. I'll put this ring together just to confirm my diameter. I want the outside of this ring to be, slightly bigger than the inside of my tube, which is what this is. So I'm in good shape. I cut all these segments. And so now I need to calculate how many of those rings do I need to put together. They're about 1 inch tall. The assembly of my rotating rings and my spacers, that totals about 6.5 inches. The small rings here, I'm going to split those into even smaller rings. So each one of these rings will give me 2 rings 3/8 of an inch tall. So the 6.5 inch dimension divided by 3/8 of an inch, well, that means I need at least 17, maybe 18 total small rings. Well, that means I'll have to create about 9 rings of this size for each of the containers. So for the 3 different containers, I'm going to have to be making a total of 27 of these rings in order to build the 3 different boxes. So first I'll go through my pile, get all the fuzziness cleaned off, and give them a good blowing, getting all the dust off, getting them really clean. I've done a dry fit, confirmed everything, but I'm still going to use the half ring technique, even though the fits are very, very good. So the little half dowel spacers, spreading glue on all the surfaces. It's a chore to put 27 rings together, but it goes pretty quickly. Plenty of rubber band pressure, as many rubber bands as it takes to put quite a bit of pressure on there. Here's my 27 rings in half ring configuration. A slit with the utility knife, a little touch up on the disc sander, and these are ready to be put together. Pretty quick and simple process there. The next step is to get a nice smooth surface on both sides of these, so some more disc sander work. I really do a close job, inspect those surfaces, and get a perfect gluable surface on both sides of all those rings. To split the rings, I'm using the chuck again with this little donut spacer. Keeps the bottom side of the ring away from the steel jaws. Minimal turning first on the inside. I'm sizing the inside of all these rings to sleeve over a piece of 1.5 inch diameter PVC pipe. The parting tool does the splitting for me. It doesn't take too long really to split all these rings into half pieces. Here's all my 27 rings split, 54 half rings. Now thin strips of double-sided tape on a board of melamine, several passes through the drum sander. These are flat, ready to glue, consistent thicknesses. Here are my stacks, but there's a little bit of tape residue from that double-sided tape, so just a quick touch up on the disc sander takes care of that. And before gluing these, a good blowing with compressed air to get them as clean as possible. Now instead of gluing these in pairs, I'm going to do them 6 at a time, using that piece of PVC pipe as a centering device. I can carefully line up my bricklay effect, clamp it in place, double check to get them as straight as possible, sand off a nice little flat area there for tape, and then split the tape on each seam. This will give me a very quick visual reference to ensure that I get them back in place the same way I want them. Applying glue to the 10 surfaces, the 5 seams, lining up the tape. Initially, I'll put some clamping pressure here just to get a majority of the glue out. That'll assist me in keeping the rings in place as I twist them into place. And then a final adjustment here before putting the final clamping pressure on. Keeping an eye on that tape as I apply clamps. It's a lot faster to do it this way than just pairs at a time. Make sure those clamps are good and tight if you try to do it this way. There's usually going to be a little bit of glue residue, And some very light sanding with the sander on coast works pretty well. It's a lot easier to control the large piece like this. All I'm trying to do is get back to those perfect sanded surfaces that I already had. Here's how I'm gluing these together using the lathe. I've got a wooden cone on the left side and my live cone on my tailstock side, a little sanded flat area with a red marker. That tells me where to line up my brick lay. Rub some glue on these. The lathe acts as both a centering device, a great centering device, and as a clamp. This is a pretty easy way to put units like this together and keep things very, very concentric to each other. Plenty of clamping pressure using that tailstock, and then when it comes time to put the third piece on for the total of 18 rings, same procedure. If you're in a hurry to use the lathe for something else, well, you can always apply some clamps and remove the unit. Now with my 3 cylinders all glued up, I can put them back on the lathe one at a time. I'll use that same wooden cone at one end and my tailstock cone on the other. That centers it pretty nicely. I'm just going to do a little bit of minimal turning here, just get rid of the glue squeeze out and get a relatively smooth surface. Now I'm using my diamond pointed scraper. I want a little tenon at both ends of this cylinder so I can mount it from either end in my big chuck. So once this is done, replace the wooden cone with the chuck. Use the cone on my tailstock to help center this perfectly. Clamp it really, solid. And I'm going to use a Forstner bit. I'm going to cheat a little bit with this drill bit. It's an 1 9/16", just slightly larger than the ID of my, constructed cylinder. So I'll run this down there more than halfway, use this sanding apparatus here, and get a nice smooth surface inside. Once I've got this all done from one end, I'll reverse it around, mount it in the other end, again using the cone at the tailstock to center things nicely. That pretty much concludes what I need to do on the inside of my cylinders or my containers. Next, I'm going to start working on my threaded end caps. I'm using some 1.5" diameter threaded pieces of ABS. These are plumbing fittings that you can buy at most any hardware store. The plastic cuts pretty easily on the lathe with a parting tool. You kind of have to get a knack for it, though, because if you heat it up, it'll melt on you before you can cut it. So it takes a little practice. Now I'm fitting up the end of my container to accept this piece of male thread. Just a matter of turn a little, check, and sneak up on a fit. Doesn't have to be super tight, but you want a snug fit, about 1/4 inch deep. Here I'm just using one piece to hold the other and checking my fit. I've got this looking pretty good right now. Obviously I want a nice flush fit between the two pieces there. In anticipation of my need for an end cap, I earlier glued together these rings, one of the leftover cylinder rings and a dark ring, which will be the end of the end cap. So to work on those end caps, I'm using that same spacer and cleaning up this outside end, putting a little tenon there so I can reverse this around and prepare the other side of this to accept the female plastic threads. Here I've reverse mounted it. Now I'm going to create an opening here that'll accept these threads, just sneaking up on a fit about a 1/4 inch or more in depth. I want to make sure nothing sticks out past the wood. As you can see here, my plastic is inside the outside edge of that wood. Here I'm putting a little tenon that'll allow me to reverse this around after I've glued in my pieces of plastic thread. I'm using ABS cement. Wasn't sure about this glue, how well it would work with wood, but this little test glue job yesterday tells me that it's pretty strong with wood, and I think it's going to work fine. I'm spreading it with a Q-tip around that whole perimeter. I'll use a fair amount of glue. I'm also going to use the male threads in order to clamp these in place using these spring clamps. I'll let this sit for at least 4 or 5 hours. It's been at least that long, and having this little puddle of glue confirms it's dry, It's also remained flexible, which I think makes this an ideal adhesive for putting plastic to wood. So I'm back to the lathe. I forgot to turn a little tenon on this end. I should have one here on this side so I can reverse this around. The others I did that. So now I've reversed it. This will allow me to go to work on the outside of my cap. I'm going to put a little floating disc in there with a keeper ring. My overall diameter for the whole container is somewhere around 2.5 inches. I'm just checking to make sure I don't take this opening a little too big. So I've finished turning that. I'll go over and put a little piece of Zeracody on this post with some CA glue. I just cut this out on the bandsaw. I'll true it up round, flatten it, and then fit it to my opening. I want a slightly sloppy fit going in there. And then I can part this off. Don't forget to sand it while I have the chance. And take this little wafer or disc, clean it up the parted side, clean it up on the disc sander, and then I can go back to this same piece of Zeracody and harvest 2 more discs for my total of 3 containers. So I'm gonna need keeper rings to put those discs in place. I've got a little ring of maple that I've glued up. CA glue attaches that to the same post. I'll true this up and sneak up on a good fit between the outside of this and the inside of my opening in my cap. Turn the inside away to get a ring about 5/16 of an inch from outside to inside. Takes a little time to get that fit just right. I can part this off. I can get the other 2 rings off that same ring of maple. Now I've put a little glue here on the 2 ingrained areas of my disc, and I've put minimal glue on my keeper ring. I've put the glue in such a way that when I push it down in there, I won't push glue onto the disc. A little turning on the lathe and this is pretty much done. I do want to check the fit between the 2 units, so I've screwed the male thread into place, and I've got a little teeny gap between these 2 units. Well, that's pretty easy to fix. All I've got to do is just turn a little bit of this plastic thread off and check it again. Now I've got a nice snug fit. To install the male threads into the container, I'm going to use the same ABS cement, but before doing that I've got to protect all these surfaces, all the adjacent surfaces inside and the outside. I'm checking the fit here one more time, and I'm adjusting the male thread in the cap so there's just a tiny gap. That'll ensure that the threads are seated all the way at the bottom of my opening in the container. And a little weight on there, and I'll let this sit for a number of hours. So now I can do a little inspection on the fit between the cap and the container body. If things don't line up, the bricklay doesn't quite line up, you can always do a little bit of adjustment using the disc sander. But my challenge now is to get this entire container to fit inside my sleeve. You can see I've got it in the chuck, and I'm using a little piece of MDF there to help support the tailstock end. The turning here is slow with a lot of checking. Use whatever kind of tools you like, but the goal obviously is to get this container to slide down inside the sleeve. You don't want a real sloppy loose fit, but you don't want it tight either. So take your time and remove wood and check frequently. You want it to freely slide inside the sleeve, and it does take a little time to get that, but it's not that tough. This end there, the chuck is a little tight, but that'll be taken care of when I turn that away. The use of a sanding block will help identify any high spots, and the use of a 5-inch power sanding pad works a lot better on these straight surfaces. Now, to deal with this end that was in the chuck, I've replaced the chuck with a wooden cone, and I've got a tailstock cone in the inverted position. Make sure this end right here, this surface is running true. Now it's a simple matter of just taking this extra material off, a little sanding, And after the sanding, the seam where the cap screws on, I've just scored a little groove there. So here are my 3 containers in their sleeves. The next challenge is to get the slots cut.